C'tan enslaved by the robotic Necrons of Warhammer 40k are some of the coolest, most badass monsters in the setting and on the tabletop. Shards of their once whole selves, each piece of the C'tan the shards represent is nowhere near the power of their old self, but each is still a formidable foe in its own right. On the tabletop though, C'tan have become a bit of an issue, as they dominate the competitive scene. But how can one balance a star god on the tabletop? Let's get into it. Welcome back to Starhammer. Right, so the C'tan Shards are absolutely kicking butt in the Warhammer scene right now, and it's caused no small amount of grief amongst the community. Despite the loud consensus that C'tan need to be reined in a little bit after their most recent update and new detachment focusing entirely on them, GW has instead opted to bury their heads in the sand and target other armies in their more recent balance updates. As a former Necrons player, I think I can speak to this. The C'tan are some of the coolest units in an already super cool army. They're incredibly tanky, deal a ton of damage, and are a great intimidation factor. Yet despite that, the C'tan weren't too much of an issue. You could easily avoid them for the most part, as a balance to their power, up until recently, was their speed. Watch your positioning, and you'd probably be okay. But with the new Necrons attachment centering around the C'tan, GW has seen fit to buff them to high hell, especially the Nightbringer, who we're going to talk about quite a bit in this video. You can't go to a game shop nowadays and not see at least one C'tan spam list and one other player who doesn't have any answers to it. And who can blame the Necron player? You basically get to take 5 to 6 Primarch level units in a single list if you really want to. You know, most take 2 or 3. And not many armies are going to be able to handle C'tan spam. So the question becomes, how do you balance such a force of literal nature on the board while not neutering them entirely? The easiest solution would just be to jack their points up, but that doesn't really fix the issue. Sure, it might stop spam lists to a degree, but I think that if you're going to try and tackle an issue like this, you need to look deeper. We need to look into the lore of the Necrons and the C'tan Shards to understand and justify why these crazy units need to be much more limited on the field. The C'tan themselves are some of the earliest intelligences to emerge in the universe, coming into being very shortly after the Big Bang. They were beings of pure energy that fed on stars, but while they were nourishing, they never quite satisfied the C'tan's thirst for a more delicious form of sustenance. Enter the Necrons, a dying race of Xenos ravaged by the hostile environments created by their home star, and recently defeated after a long war against another Xenos empire known as the Old Ones. The Necrons were jealous of the Old Ones and their mastery of the universe, including their health and the unity their society enjoyed. When the Old Ones refused to share their secrets, the Necrons tried to take it by force, and failed. First contact was made between the Necrons and the C'tan shortly after this war, and in the Necrons, the C'tan found what they had been craving since their inception: willing servants and tasty souls. The Necrons began to worship the C'tan as gods and become their servants, eventually crafting necrodermis bodies for them to inhabit and experience the physical world for the first time. This new wave of sensations jacked up the hunger of the C'tan to 10, and the C'tan began to gorge themselves on their new forms of energy, that of biological souls. The C'tan saw the ultimate opportunity. They tricked the Necrons into the biotransference process, turning the dying race into the immortal Necrons we know today, with promises of immortality, invincible bodies, and unity. All the things the Necrons had craved for so long were given to them, but at the cost of the C'tan enslaving them and consuming the souls of the species. And we all know what happened next. The Necrons and the C'tan destroyed the Old Ones, and shortly after, the Silent King led his revolt and destroyed the C'tan, sort of. Since the C'tan were made from the very fabric of the universe itself, they couldn't be destroyed outright. Instead, the Necrons are able to break them up into smaller shards and imprison them that way. The Necrons now have the C'tan under their thumb, at least most of them, and these shards are only unleashed as a last resort by Necron commanders due to the small, but not zero chance that the shard breaks free to exercise its revenge upon the Necrons controlling it. And therein lies our lore explanation for a more balanced C'tan rule set on the tabletop. These guys are weapons of last resort, only let out when the situation is at its most dire. Balancing lore in 40k and the tabletop is something GW I think does relatively well, but in this instance, they've seriously dropped the ball. If the C'tan Shards are so unbelievably scary that even in-lore Necrons don't mess with them unless they absolutely have to, why are players allowed to run 6 of them in one list if they so choose? Obviously, nobody's going to run all 6. You really can't run all 6. You need, an actual character warlord in there. But the point I'm trying to make is to question why that's even an option available to players. One could make the argument that it shows GW cares about player choice by not restricting unit choices. sure, but in doing so, it violates the foundation Games Workshop has already established. In doing so, GW has made the game extremely unbalanced and in favor of Necron players. I cannot take more than one Magnus in my Thousand Suns list, yet a Necrons player can take 3 Transcendent C'tan and have a Primarch on pretty much every part of the board at all times. Let's look at the datasheet so you can see why this is an issue. All the shards have the same stats and base abilities of Deep Strike, 5-up Field Net Pay, Necrodermis that reduces all incoming damage by 1, Reanimation Protocols, and Deadly Demise. The Transcendent C'tan is 305 points, with 1 ranged weapon option and 1 melee option. Your shooting is pretty decent for such short range, but keep in mind, this guy is meant to be teleporting all over the board when you advance him on account of that transdimensional displacement ability. So you don't really need anything to snipe units with. It's still strong enough to wound most infantry on a 2 or maybe a 3, and dealing 2 wounds per attack at 2 AP, pretty devastating to most squads, on top of that sustained 1. Your melee is a little less consistent, but we make up for that with a number of attacks and the sustained 1. Obviously this is meant to be your AT option, but that melee profile is going to make a short work of even tougher infantry or monster models such as Mauler Fiends or Obliterators. For 305, I think the Transcendent is actually decent. It might be able to zoom all over the board, but you can screen it if you're careful, and having to make 9-inch charges almost every time does leave it vulnerable to failure. I think probably 315 is more reasonable points cost for it, but the real issue is being able to take 3 of them, since this isn't an epic hero like the other 3. Horde armies are going to have an easier time screening for 3 of these things, but eventually you're going to have to move up your rear guard to support your front line at some point in the game. A good C'tan player will hang a couple of these guys back and wait for the right moment to pop them behind you when you do so. Now you've got a mini Primarch or 2 behind your lines, and you've got 2 fronts to contend with. In what universe is it okay to take 3 of these? You could counter that taking 3 Demon Princes in a Chaos army is a similar ordeal, but I would point you back to the lore of the C'tan Shards. Demon Princes are Demon Princes. They're a dime a dozen and don't really have much holding them back from deploying large numbers of force. Demon Princes are also generally better served in support roles rather than frontline fighters. As such, they're cheaper and you're more inclined to keep them back to buff your units as opposed to charging them into the fray. With any C'tan Shard, you're incentivized to play them quite aggressively. Not only can they soak massive amounts of damage, but they can dish it out too. Look no further than the Shard of the Nightbringer. Now, as the embodiment of death, it makes sense that this thing can throw down some hate on the board. The range attack's pretty mid for taking out anything infantry, but pretty darn good for bringing down monsters or vehicles, or getting them softened up for a charge, which is where this guy really shines. He does D3 mortals to all enemy units within 6 inches at the end of the fight phase by rolling a 4-up for each of those, and his melee profiles are downright foul. Both are well equipped for anti-infantry and anti-vehicle rolls. For 315 points, I think the Nightbringer is way too cheap for what it can do. Let's compare him to Magnus, the Primarch that I'm most familiar with. Magnus is a powerhouse on the board, coming in at a whopping 435 points. A stat block like this, plus the ability to reduce damage by 1 and even blank damage from an attack confronting Grand Coven, makes Magnus a very scary threat indeed. I ran Magnus against the Nightbringer in Unit Crunch, allowing me to see the math of the amount of damage units can potentially do in an encounter across range and melee, factoring in things like dev wounds and other weapon keywords. I started with Magnus into the Nightbringer, with ranged, as you can see, across both attacks, Magnus only doing about 4 on average. After the FMP, it saves the Katana rolled. Not the greatest, but Magnus' strength to dish out disgusting damage than his melee. In melee, Magnus fared a little better, dishing out an expected 7 wounds to the Nightbringer on average in their first melee encounter. And the Nightbringer is going to have a little bit harder of a time keeping up with Magnus and melee at that range. Magnus' chances of doing 7 or better on damage are relatively high, and that was generally consistent. When we flip the table around, we see a much different story. In terms of range, the Nightbringer doesn't have too good of a chance to do a lot of damage to Magnus with those D3 attacks. Like with Magnus, I expected that to be in the lower end, doing similar damage with about a 3 at the mean of the stats. Across melee, however, the Nightbringer deals 11 damage to Magnus on average across both attacks, with a strike profile obviously being able to clock a higher number itself at around 9 damage. This also isn't factoring in the potential D3 mortals after the fight phase ends, and you're likely to roll 2 most of the time on that one, so we'll round this up to 13 total damage to Magnus from both profiles, but we'll say 11 damage with just the strike on average, which if you add the 2 mortals to that from the 11 damage from strike, that puts us up to 13. Magnus only has 16 wounds. That is absolutely nuts. For only 315 points on average, you have a 52.7% chance of seriously wounding Magnus in melee with this guy. Magnus has a slightly higher chance to do 7 or more to the Nightbringer, and fuck it, we'll throw a Doombolt Ritual in there as well, with about 2 mortals on average. Provided the C'tan doesn't FMP it, you're looking at, let's say, 9 damage on average in melee after it's all said and done. Obviously Doombolt's done in shooting phase, but you get the idea. This is assuming you don't need Doom Bolt to tackle another problem elsewhere on the board. So again, Magnus is getting pretty messed up in this encounter more times than not. Magnus has a 1.4% chance of slaying the C'tan, and the C'tan has a 23.6% chance of slaying Magnus. Is this starting to make a little more sense? Why the hell is the literal embodiment of death 315 points compared to a Primarch at 435? This isn't me saying that Magnus needs to be cheaper by any means. I think he's fine where he's at. Magnus also does a few other synergy things that warrant a higher points cost. The issue I have is that Necron players can take several Primarch level units, and they even have a new detachment that encourages spamming said unit, which in the lore is a literal force of nature barely able to be contained. I'm not going to go through and run the stats on every shard against Magnus because we'd be here all day, but I think this gets my point across. This isn't just me bitching about C'tan spam. Okay, well it is, but at least I have the data to back it up. So what do? We could always crank up the points on the Nightbringer as our example, and that would help a little bit, but you still have 3 other C'tan shards in the list you might potentially need to deal with. The new detachment for Necrons being focused on C'tan is also a problem in and of itself. Now, I've said that if your army is relying on 1 or 2 beefy units, then you need to rethink your list, but this detachment chucks that out the window. Nobody is going to be bringing 5 C'tan, but even having the option shouldn't be a thing. Most lists are going to run 2 to 3 shards, and who can blame them, regardless of detachment. They're criminally cheap for what they can do, plus you can couple some Technomancers to heal them D3 wounds on top of their reanimation protocols, and or keep a reanimator nearby for extra healing as well. This makes C'tan spam a serious problem that a lot of armies either aren't going to have the means to deal with, or they're going to have to tailor their list to deal with them instead of running the list they actually want to run. What GW has created here, unintentionally, is a C'tan problem that lessens the experience of the game. This probably isn't going to be meaningfully fixed with the end of the edition being so close, and that's fine, so the immediate solution would be to jack up the points on C'tan across the board and call it a day. What we should do is actually justify such a faction nerf using the established lore. 1, maybe 2 at most in special detachment should be allowed per list. There's absolutely no reason Necron players should be able to take multiple Primarch level units in a balanced game. And while it is normally a delicate process trying to balance lore and tabletop, I think this is pretty cut and dry. Limiting access to these units unless in a special rule set with points reflective of the capabilities of the models is the way to go. Removing their access to reanimation protocols could also go a long way as well. Maybe a fun mechanic to add in would be a containment check, where the controlling player rolls a d6 at the end of their turn to see if the C'tan shard stays contained. On a 1, the opponent gets to choose a Necron unit within range of the C'tan shard to make an attack against to symbolize the shard breaking containment protocols for a brief moment. There are a lot of options, but ultimately, the solution to the C'tan problem is within the established lore itself. The Nightbringer, as an example, and its points should reflect what it can do at the very least. That should be the case with all the shards. With 11th edition almost upon us, I really hope that we can find solutions like these so that Necrons aren't kicking everyone's shit in and the game is more balanced and more enjoyable because of it. List tailoring is generally pretty unfun in my opinion, so here's to hoping Games Workshop gives us a bone to run what we want to run against Necrons and not what we have to run to stand a chance against C'tan shard spam lists. That'll do it for this one, y'all. As a former Necrons player, I enjoy C'tan, but would always feel a little dirty running more than one of them. Not a lot of players will have it in their list to handle multiple of them, and at the moment, doing so seems like a big fuck you to your opponent. The current C'tan meta lessens the experience of the game, but I think that we can put some limits on them in a fairly tame manner that makes more sense than just a points increase. But what do you all think? Especially you Necron players out there. How would y'all tackle this issue next edition if you were a GW designer? Let me know down in the comments. As always, drop a like if you like it, a subscribe if you really liked it, hit the notification bell so you never miss a video, and check the community tab for shitpost and shenanigans. See y'all in the next one.